I'm really excited to welcome you all to the first event of this term's Space Syntax Lab seminars, not only because we are about to hear an exciting talk by Lars Marcus, but also because we have, with more than 270 registrations, one of the largest audiences ever for this series. And as you all might have seen, we have, besides Lars' talk today, also 3 other very interesting events to look forward to, with work by Francesca Freud on agglomeration economies, Hartai on the economic significance of informal alleyways, and Victoria Baker presenting a spatial analysis of domestic architecture in historic London. So please make sure to register for these as well if you haven't done so already. Today, however, we will hear from Professor Lars Marcus on spatial capital, how the spatial form of the cities creates value in urban land and processes. And Lars is a professor in urban design at the Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg in Sweden. He has led the development of internationally well-known research groups in spatial morphology, both at KTH and Chalmers. Lars has also been a long-standing member of the space syntax community and made substantial theoretical and methodological contributions through numerous proceedings, journal articles, and the development of analytical tools, such as his 2005 paper on place syntax, his 2010 JOS article introducing the notion of spatial capital, as well as the open source QGIS place syntax tool in 2019, to name only some. Besides his academic engagement, Lars has also been involved as an expert advisor in Scandinavia's largest urban development project in Gothenburg, and also regularly participates in Swedish public debates. He's also the founder and partner of the consultancy Spacescapes, which is bridging the gap between research and practice, offering analytical support in planning projects. And with this, I'm looking forward to an exciting talk and like to hand over to you, Lars.
Thank you so much, Kimon. This is really exciting. I was very happy to be invited to what I thought was a small seminar with the Space Syntax Lab group, and looking forward to that and some catching up on what we've been doing at Chalmers in recent years. And now we see a large crowd here, which I hope I can have something that may be interesting to you. Of course, it's very, very nice for me to be invited to this and to come back and talk in the context of the Space Syntax Lab, since most of what I've been doing over the years in my academic careers origins in the work done at UCL and the Space Syntax Lab. So many things that you will see now, you will recognize and see the origins of, and so forth. And not least, wonderful is it to see also Laura present today, who was the one that taught me how to draw an axial map some 25 years ago. I don't know if I remember how to do it anymore. We have to do it again, Laura. You have to teach me again. So wonderful. And let's see. I will try to introduce, my thought was to just update a few things that we've been working on. So it will be a little bit jumping over to different things we've been doing. But frame will be this broad idea about spatial capital, which I've used for many years now to just have as a framework to a lot of our different research projects and so forth, to put them in and so forth. So let me share my screen here and start. And actually that has been, as I say, some kind of a framework. I've started to have the idea that we have so many disparate projects and things that we do. So maybe one has had a possibility to put this into a rather or a larger framework. And that's what I've been talking about as spatial capital for a long time, even though maybe it's not always been clear what's it about. Maybe we're moving a little bit further in that now. And I tried to capture this in a book manuscript that's I've been working on for embarrassingly long time now. But there is a lot of things now that are kind of excerpts to that that I will talk about. But if we skip into this idea about capital right away, of course you enter or start to address a very evasive concept, problematic concept, a controversial concept at times even. What do we really mean by that? And of course, I here enter fields that is far from my expertise. This is really the home base of economics. But I have come to realize that what we do in morphology, space syntax, and so forth is extraordinarily important for these concepts and ideas. And in turn, I think we have something to contribute here to understanding of these very vital and central economic concepts. Today, of course, we almost identify capital with money. And in a way, of course, that is true, that's a very broad and relevant way of looking at it. But if we go to the origins, it rather come from the old classical political economy, where capital was one of the production factors. That is the means necessary to produce something. So on the one hand, it's of course concerns labor, human work, but of course also land. And at the time of Adam Smith and David Ricardo and those, it of course was very much about agricultural land. So it has to do with good fertility and things like that. But increasingly also as a raw material for the industrial production, coal or iron ore and things like that. And in this connection, capital was, of course, rather the machines and tools that could enhance work, looked upon as a kind of embodied labor that enhanced new labor, so we could work more efficiently. So, but at the same time, of course, if you have money, you can buy all of this. So on a more abstract level, it can be relevant to talk about capital as money, of course, or other forms of assets. And of course, we can also look at money as some kind of embodied labor in a more abstract sense. So there is often a jump here between this more abstract idea about capital and a more concrete idea about capital when it has to do with technology, really, and technological development. Of course, so capitalism in that sense, of course, is very closely knit to technological development. But if we start to talk to some of these old economists like Adam Smith, it immediately becomes rather confusing. He starts out dividing capital into circulating capital and fixed capital. And when he talks about circulating capital, he talks about capital used up in the production process and exemplifies by saying such as raw materials and wages to labor. So suddenly he seems to be talking about capital as labor and land in the meaning of raw materials, and not so much capital as the way we are come to understand it. So again, I guess this has to do with this ability of on a more abstract level, you can buy most anything with capital, and some of it you use up in the production process. On the other hand, we have fixed capital, which is capital not immediately used up in the process, such as tools, machines, and buildings. And there you are, there you have this more traditional idea about capital as embodied labor. And importantly, he includes buildings into this. So in the next step, when he starts to talk more about fixed capital, it gets a bit confusing again, but for new reasons. He identifies 4 types of fixed capital. And the first one we recognize, the useful machines and instruments of trade, which facilitates and abridge labor. Yes, we recognize that. But it's also those profitable buildings which are the means of procuring a revenue. Okay, yes, we're onto that too. And I guess, find it interesting that buildings here really constitutes a capital, also in Adam Smith's mind. But then we come to the improvements of land and what has been profitably laid out in clearing, draining, enclosing, and even manuring. And now it gets a little bit more strange. And now he seems to be talking very much about land and how it can be enhanced in different ways, but not land as raw materials, but rather as spatial extension, or what we often talk about as space, I guess. And then he rounds off with something that is rather surprising. He also talks about capital as the acquired and useful abilities of all the inhabitants and members of society. What he seems to be talking about is what we today call human capital. So again, you see already here at the origin of this, it's rather confusing and it's used in very many different ways. And especially there seems to be some kind of ambiguity around land that can confront us in very different forms. And whatever the reason is, over time, and this is a long story, it's rather exciting, and maybe for some other discussion, things were simplified so that today, to a large extent, land is subsumed under capital. So we don't often talk about land, as I understand it, in modern economics, and actually haven't done so for maybe 150 years. It goes back to the 19th century, this kind of simplification where land kind of disappears. And one simple explanation can be that land was very much connected to agricultural economy. And of course, what we've seen in the 20th century is an industrial economy where agriculture played a very minor role. But there are also many other dimensions. Anyway, therefore, we have this rather simplified way of talking of the means of production or the factors of production that today very much concerns labor and capital. And today, for instance, when we talk about robotization and so forth, and we have seen that throughout the 20th century, how we have seen how capital can substitute labor, or we can turn labor into machines to develop a higher productivity. And then you can spend your money buying either labor or capital, depending on what's cheapest on the market if you want to produce something. Anyway, this is the beginning, because there are some ambiguities here that I will come back to. This is the first one. There seems to be something conceptually hidden here as a result. Land is generally subsumed under capital in economic theory. And yes, you can go further into that, and I'm not the expert, but this is very much what I understand has happened in economic theory, when it talks about capital and labor, but very little about land. So land kind of disappears here, and thereby also space to a large extent. But if we start looking at land more directly, and especially its value as property value, we see another division that maybe we do not always recognize. And that is that the property value actually consists of two things. On the one hand, what we in simple terms can call building value, often also called land improvements. And on the other hand, land value. So there's two dimensions as we have the land in itself, so to speak, and then we have land improvements, often in the form of buildings. And these two make up the value of land. So we can build a building, improve land by a new building, and that will increase the property value through the building value. But where is the land value? How do we measure that? Well, that is exactly when location comes in. It has to be where things are located. The same building in different parts of the same city or in different cities will generate very different property values depending on the land value that has to do which has to do with the location. Obviously, if the address here is very important for what the value of the building or the piece of land. So here again, we see a kind of separation between two different concepts, but where one of the building, of course, is very apparent to us, whereas location is something far less possible to determine, more difficult to determine. So here we have a second kind of thing that kind of brings in some kind of conceptual confusion to this, and that is that value of land often is hidden behind the building value in real estate economics, even though obviously one talks about this in real estate economics, about the land value and location, as we know. But often we also look very much to the enhancement of land through buildings, and that kind of takes the center stage in such discussions. But when we start to look into this a little bit more and try to understand how they are created, we realize that building value to a great extent primarily is determined by what we can call building density. I mean, the higher the density, the more improved, so to speak, is the land. And of course, we have a great focus on this also in planning, in public debate, in real estate economics, the density of the built city. And that is, of course, very much a concern about the building value. But actually, the land value is determined by something else, by accessibility, actually. And at least in a Swedish context, we talk about this much less in urban planning and design, and also in public debate, also when it concerns how to create qualities in the city and so forth. So, and it's actually rather difficult to get this dimension of the accessibility into the planning system, because it's often very divided into small pieces of properties that are developed, and this overarching structure that generates so much of the value is not properly concerned. And also perhaps that there are less knowledge developed on this. Obviously, you see here, this is exactly what space syntax does, of course, tries to develop an understanding of what we here call accessibility in the city and how it creates qualities, but also value. Moreover, the building value is very much realized by private actors. I mean, this is where the different developers come in and develop land and exploit land according to certain plans and so forth. Whereas the accessibility is primarily realized by public actors. And given the fact that in a property value, most often if you are in an urban setting, the majority of the value in a property value is generated by the location and far less by the buildings or the land improvements. And the larger the city, the more important the location becomes and the less important the land improvement for the property value. I mean, in London, for instance, it's, you know, you tear down buildings that are 10 years old because they have such an excellent location that it's worthwhile to do that and build a little bit taller building on the same location and make even more money, which clearly tells us how it's the land value that's primary. But then it means also that, and anyway, you stop there. So there is also another one of these things that is not always clear in when we talk about land. So a third conclusion is that public capital often is hidden behind private capital when we talk about development. And if we push this a little bit further, we realize also that the building value or land improvements, of course, often are funded by private capital, but the land value often is funded by tax on labor. It's a public investment. And where does the money come? Well, it comes from labor, tax on labor to a large extent, tax on many, many other things too. But in relation to the primary production factors in economics, we see here a taxing of labor that actually leads to investment that enhance the value of land. So here's the fourth conclusion, that we tax labor to increase the wealth of landowners. Now, many of us are landowners, not least because we own the house we live in and so forth, or the apartment we live in, but not all of us. So there is a huge, so to speak, transition of money here from or value and wealth from labor to those of us that are landowners, which is quite apparent and right interesting. And these are not small numbers. If you start to look how much of the global wealth is actually in real estate, we can see that global wealth in total is estimated to about $361 trillion. Whereas the real estate globally, all real estate, the value of that is estimated to $281 trillion. This means that the global wealth, 78% of global wealth is constituted by real estate. And the residential real estate is a very, very large portion here. So there is extraordinary values and numbers here that we're talking about. And it seems like this is something we have problem really capturing and talking with some precision about. I happened here to read in preparation for something else, Thomas Piketty, for instance, who exactly talks about this transition from our earnings from work to capital, so to speak, already old wealth that may be inherited and so, such as land. But he, for instance, talks, when he started to talk about this, he kind of subsumes immediately land into capital for the reason that it's so difficult to actually estimate and describe the value of land. Not the property value, which often can be seen in the market when we sell land, but the land in itself is rather difficult to estimate. And that's quite extraordinary because we realize that this is probably the most valuable thing we have on the globe, and we're not very good in describing it. But this is exactly where we could make some kind of contribution, I think, actually from our side, and not least the whole space syntax tradition. On the one hand, trying to put a name on this kind of capital, which is what I would call then spatial capital, and start to analyze it, measure it, and describe it in different ways. And of course, that is exactly what's been done in space syntax for a long time. And that is something that we've been trying to add to and learn from in our different research environments also in Sweden, both at KTH and Chalmers, and also made some contributions to. So fundamentally, I understand spatial capital to be capital that improves the density and accessibility of land, which comes close to what is very much done in space syntax. But we also have added this thing with density here, which I will come back to, and how to analyze that in a particular way. So from this point of view, one could start to describe spatial capital by different morphological variables. And we have often talked in both the KTH and Chalmers about this as a distance, densification, and differentiation, where distance concerns the improvement of land by connecting locations by streets. And about that, we've learned everything from space syntax. But then we also brought in densification, which concerns the improvement of land by adding floor space. You can, in particular important locations, you can make the planet or the globe a little bit larger by adding floor space in these locations. But you can also differentiate land and improve it thereby by dividing it into different plots. Land can be divided into different pieces, and the size and the configuration of these pieces can prove very important. So here we have a broader set of morphological variables that we can work with to describe what we call here spatial capital. And if we start with distance, I don't need to tell you anything here. It's the whole tradition from the old classical investigations and so forth. I was happy enough to visit the village Cassin a couple of years ago, so I had the opportunity to take a few portraits of the axial lines that one has been looking at so many times. And of course, we've seen this in so many situations and in so many cities, and how it has brought light and understanding to these cities, this kind of analysis. So I will leave this as it is and rather talk a little bit more about density. And density is, of course, probably the most referred to concept when it comes to urban development, exactly from this economic point of view. What kind of density are we building? Because it's part of the economic calculation of these types of projects. But density is very problematic, and not least the way it's measured in the real estate economics as FSI, the simple how much added floor space to a certain ground space in a very simple term. All these three have the same density. So density descriptions don't tell us much about the quality of urban development or new projects in cities. Of course, there are other measures, and there's several of them. And here, of course, my close colleague Meta Berghauser-Pont, I think, has also visited you and talked about many things, I think, but also about this and the very many different ways we can measure density, and not least that they capture very different dimensions of qualities in urban development projects. Just to see how the distribution of density in the two images in Gothenburg there are very different depending on what you are measuring. And of course, there are also other things that, other ways of measuring density that not least Meta has worked very intensely with. But we have also worked together on trying to understand if could we measure density as accessibility. And that's a fundamental shift then from area-based density measures, which is what you normally find. You try to, in different way, describe and measure added floor space to ground space, and then you get a density. But that is what you could call an area-based density measure. You can also do location-based density measures, and then it instead turns into an accessibility measure. What you measure is how much floor space do I reach from a particular location within a certain radius. And that gives a very different description. You can use the same data and get very different descriptions. And again, it's about what you're looking for. One can be good for certain things and the other for other things, obviously. And of course, this goes back to the paper that Gibbon was nice enough to refer to about place syntax that we did in 2005, which concerns very much the same thing. So on the one hand, you can have density of floor space per plot, as you see to the left. And then we simply use the axial map and the kind of measurements of centrality, or what in this case it turns into accessibility. We reach something, in this case floor space or density. And you instead then turns it into an accessibility measure or a location-based measure. So instead you get accessibility to floor space from each plot, for instance. And you get, so it's the same data in the two, but you measure it very differently, and you can use it for different things. And of course, this tool, there's a tool for this called Place Syntax tool that you can, of course, in principle measure the accessibility to anything. So here is a big shift from what's mostly done in Space Syntax, where you have rather a centrality analysis of the network, into an accessibility analysis of the ability to access certain resources or attractions. So you could put almost anything into this tool, not necessarily floor space. It can be residential, or it can be pizza restaurants or parks or bus stops or anything. So it has turned out to be a very useful tool for us for many, many, many things. And of course, you can use them to make different analysis and descriptions on different radii of cities and so on. But fundamentally, in the bottom here, you have the more traditional centrality analysis of Space Syntax, but you add or you weigh it towards different attractions or resources that you want to analyze for. And it could be almost anything. And then we have a third one that maybe still is less developed, but we find very interesting, and that is differentiation. And it starts out with a very fundamental idea, I guess, that different physical objects actually can be designed spatially so that they get different capacities to carry difference. So, and thereby you can also establish categories by space. So in this case, if you have chest of drawers of this kind, the volume of course is the same, but if you have 1, 2 or 4 drawers, it makes a huge difference how you can sort things. If you put your clothes in the one to the left with just 1 drawer, it gets rather messy, and the diversity between and the categorization of your clothes doesn't go very far. And then you could put in the middle one, you could put trousers and shirts, for instance, and in the 4th one you could go even further and so forth. So there's a kind of fundamental thing here about space, that it kind of creates the limits how far we can categorize things. And I find that extraordinarily interesting idea. And the same is true in very different scales. You could look at countries. There's a much higher differentiation, a much higher capacity, so to speak, in Austria than traditional Slovakia, depending on the much lower division of land under the communist rule. And that I think there are very strong traces of still. But of course, also in buildings, we can divide space into more or less rooms or spaces. And that also creates categories, so to speak. So there's something very interesting, I think, here that has to do with spatial differentiation, division of land and or spaces into more or less individual spaces, and how this kind of creates fundamental conditions for diversity of different kinds. And I think we can sense that also in some new areas where everything seems to be right, but there's something missing. You want to create the kind of traditional city, and these are pictures from Stockholm, in some kind of a new urbanist way, and everything seems to be in place, but there's something missing, and that's the differentiation. There's some kind of same flavor to the whole thing to the right, because they are not different. And this has to do with the differentiation of space. And the idea, of course, is that this also can have a very important impact on how we use space, the diversity in land uses in cities and so forth. Because if you have just one or a few plots, means that you only have one or a few owners in that area of the city. And that probably also means that you have only one or a few strategies for developing that area. Whereas if you have many, there can be very many strategies that allow for very different contents in this, not least if they can exist over time and establish it oneself. To my mind, this relates to the maybe least discussed parameter of Jane Jacobs, the old buildings idea. Okay, I avoid going into that. But anyway, the kind of diversity given by a more divided plot structure. But also this could be turned into an accessibility analysis, a more location-based analysis instead of an area-based, because we could then measure, for instance, the density of plots, of course, but we could also measure the accessibility to plots using the same place syntax tool, doing the same thing, and then also start to make studies where we can correlate this to different phenomena and so forth. And also describe cities that are very different. For instance, when we did this large analysis of Amsterdam and Gothenburg and Stockholm, also London, we realized how, of course, the Swedish cities were smaller and they were far more dispersed than both Amsterdam and London, but they had much larger plots. You don't know that, but that says a lot about Sweden, but that's for some other time. We have also conducted a very, very large empirical investigation of this fundamental relation, central also for space syntax research, between spatial form and pedestrian movement. And we did that simultaneously in 3 large European cities, Stockholm, Amsterdam, and London. And thank you very much again, Space Syntax Lab, who helped out a lot here and were very important in that work. And in that study, we tracked anonymized Wi-Fi signals from mobile phones, and we worked in 18 to 20 areas in each city. I think a little bit fewer in some of them because we had some problems, but generally speaking, something of that dimension. So that means about 300 streets in each city. The areas chosen were very different density types. And there were also streets with very different centrality type, that is very different types of streets, of course. And we did this during 3 weeks in October 2017, and it wasn't simultaneously 1 week, one city at a time, but in close connection. And the observation were done from 6 to 22 and Monday to Friday. And over this very large empirical material, this huge data set, I think it was a little bit more than 2 million observations. And Jana Stavroulaki, who is with us now, could correct me if I'm wrong. Jana was actually absolutely instrumental in making this happen from beginning to the end. So again, I am much impressed by Jana's work here. But the correlations from this huge material was, of course, varied between different areas. But as a mean value, the correlation was about 0.65. And again, we should remember that we use now also the possibility to weigh this. So it's not a simple closeness centrality or betweenness centrality. It was weighted towards it was the fundamental centrality value that was the most important in these studies. But there were some corrections made, I think, through by weighting about space that were very important to also bring the correlation a little bit up. So I think this is one very significant contribution to the long row of different studies that has been done on this particular relation between the spatial form and pedestrian movement, which of course enhances the models we have and that we can rely on, and that seems to make sense. And here is another one contribution to that argument. And having that with us, this whole way of describing and seeing that descriptions we have of the morphological variables we have relate to a very fundamental process in cities, that is human movement. We can start to address all these large urban problems that we see around us today. And thereby, if we put it in the context of spatial capital, we could talk about it as enhancing the use value of urban systems. Value can be many things. It can be a concern very much economics and money or monetary values, but it also very much the use value. Normally what we work with. So that could also be seen as a dimension of spatial capital, of course. But if we have these abilities to describe spatial form, these using different variables and so forth, then we really can address this. And I know, of course, you've done this for several decades in London and all in the space syntax communities all over the world. And not least on similar themes as we see here. For instance, segregation, where Ann Legby at KTH has done some extraordinary work, but also in economic systems as local markets, which many have done, which we've done also at Chalmers. But maybe, so I will not talk much about that. You know all of that, how we can understand these processes and so forth, and also how we can inform urban plan design to remedy these problems or support local markets and so forth that are maybe weak and all these things. But I think a more original contribution we've made is where we have also addressed ecological systems. As we all know, these are becoming much more important in cities and are talked about very, very much. And not least when it comes to certain things, such things as pollination, then Meta has done some very important work. But to do this, we cannot just take what we normally have. We cannot just apply axial maps or road center lines and try to understand ecosystems through that. We need to develop a particular form of spatial morphology where we combine both the social and ecological. And here we have had the fortune to work for now over a decade with urban ecologists that have been very exciting for us, and trying, and together with them, not least also develop this kind of a combined spatial morphology. So we can bring the traditional things, you know, from urban morphology, consent, Carnegie, and so forth, and we bring it together with what's done in ecology, where it's called a landscape ecology. And you start to realize that there are similarities here, that these are, you know, this is kind of a spatial morphology of natural landscapes, just as we have our urban morphology of urban landscapes. And there seems to be a possibility to bring them together. And this is exactly what we try to do, and how to describe then cities and as at the same time social and ecological, because as we have learned in recent decades, cities are full or replete with ecosystems, even though we don't always recognize them. And we could, if we knew how, support them much more in urban planning and design. And of course, then they can generate all these ecosystem services that they create much higher quality of life in cities, and all these things that you well know. So we've developed this in 2 papers that I'm quite proud of, actually, and I think they're quite original, and you can find them in Urban Morphology. There's one from 2019 and one from 2020, and the first one is very much based on a more traditional urban morphology description, and a combination with how this is done in landscape ecology and how this could combine. But we also, much inspired by space syntax, looked at it as a network, and how to understand how the different green spaces in cities are connected. And I cannot go into detail on this, but of course we here need to remember that the agent, what we represent in the axial map traditionally, the human ability to overlook and move in space and so forth, we have different agents here, and actually we have many agents. And here I think the whole idea about affordance theory and so forth, how the same physical space generate very different affordances to different types of agents. It can concern humans, whether we are young or old, or they can concern when we sit on a bike, space becomes very different, and so forth. But of course, if you are a bee, or if you are a bird or something else, space also changes. Space gives rise to a very different affordance to this. And that means that we need to make descriptions and analysis of space in a very different manner to understand how these agents may behave in a spatial, urban spatial setting. But again, I think some of these DGA analysis and so forth takes this a bit further. But of course, here's a lot of new work possible to do. But we try to outline that in that second paper on that, the kind of more network dimension of us. Social ecological spatial morphology. Now, last thing, I've been very long here maybe. Also talking about, because by the reason we do this, all this research is of course, on the one hand, because we're very curious and want to understand what's going on and so forth, but also because we think to how we can support practice here, because we of course see the huge challenges around us these days that seem to be more or less impossible, but we realize that many of these challenges are concerning cities and how the cities are built and what kind of physical environment these create for us humans, and how they influence our behavior and so forth, and lifestyles and all these things. So the spatial form of cities, of course, seems extraordinarily central to so many challenges we see today. So of course, all this knowledge we're talking about here and we all work with seems very important here. So how can we bring this into the practices of urban planning and design? And here we have also had very close relations to some of the major cities in Sweden, Gothenburg not least, but also with Stockholm and some smaller cities, and where we have tried to bring this knowledge into the practices of these municipalities. In Sweden, we have a very strong planning tradition. It's the municipalities that decide how land should be used and thereby built and so forth. So they have a huge influence what's happening. But at the moment, I think they do not make use of the latest knowledge when it comes into this field. And we have tried to bring that into to that discussion. Not least since now the big thing that everybody talks about is how the planning process should be digitalized. And when you look what's been done in Sweden, at least, you get very surprised. Maybe one can say what one is doing is maybe doing what one has always been doing, but you do it digitally instead. When obviously this is an opportunity to bring in a lot new knowledge into this. Not least transforming from the old paper maps into digital models of cities and starting and work from that. So our proposal, and we have tried in the discussion of these cities, and some of them have actually started to work with it. We are working with this, with our tools and these concepts and theories and so forth quite intensively. Is that rather than having a lot of different maps, of course, and also not yet we're running into making everything 3D and visualize every little thing. What digitalization could do is create a really powerful and condensed model of spatial form, but the vital dimensions of spatial form. So in this, you see, of course, the network, in this case, the motorized network of Gothenburg, but the blue shades are all the different plots. And in this case, as you recognize using Play Syntax tool, you can see that it's the accessibility from each and every plot to floor space or density within a certain radius, which I don't remember right now. So you have both these dimensions. You have the accessibility, density, the centrality of the network, street network. And fundamentally, I mean, that answers a lot of questions, as we know, before we run into all the 3D modeling and all of that. So if you have that as a basis, they could support, of course, because we need these comprehensive plans when we work on that. So that could be based, that kind of comprehensive planning work could be based on this kind of a model. And also support, and when we move into some kind of intermediate level and down to the detailed level. Because what we know, one thing that we do realize for many reasons, but also through all the done work on space syntax, is that the different scales here interact, and a lot of the values that we look for on the detail level are actually created on a very different scale and quite far away from where we're working. So here we can start to realize and work more properly in creating the qualities we want by jumping between scales in a very free manner, of course. And it's not sensational what I'm saying, but to bring this actually into the work of the municipalities in Sweden, it is a rather large step. And I think they realize all the value of this, and not least how this also can keep the basic model up to date all the time. Because if you're working with one project and someone else is working with another project somewhere else, it may very well influence what you're doing, and so forth. So this is in a very short version of how we talk about how to implementing this in the planning process, where you don't need to go from one scale to the next scale and then to the detail scale. You can have a much more freer form and really thereby be able to create the qualities you look for in the planning process. But you could also use it to an extension of that value, the kind of interventions you do, or the planning you do in the urban planning practice and urban design practice. And this is one of our more recent projects where we're working together with economists to trying to evaluate the different interventions, and of course then valuing what we have called spatial capital and trying to describe that a little bit closer. Just to illustrate briefly, I mean, so if we have three projects running at the same time, it's obvious that these are likely to also influence each other, and maybe one of the projects will create values in one of the others or destroy values in another one. By being aware of this and being able to model this, we could make also much more correct or more better project calculations of what really costs money. Are we ending up with the right evaluations here, or are we simplifying too much and not realizing that we are creating value maybe far from our individual project and so forth? And there you could think of actually paying each other for doing things, or and so forth. You could have some kind of exchange here, bringing up the whole process to a more correct analysis of the values actually created. But this would be the kind of more private individual projects that you would develop maybe. But at the same time, this municipality could look at this as in a broader scale, and realizing that not as things often are now, that each and every project has to be go even. You could lose some on one project because you realize that that will be made up from another project, and overall, and thereby creating overall value in the city as a whole. And this could also then support the municipality's ability to follow this. This is something we're just starting looking at this last part, and we hope to, we'll see where we end up with that. But fundamentally, it concerns valuing what we've been called spatial capital, which is one of these things that we realize also in economics not all often is so easy to estimate or describe or analyze or measure. So I'm not saying that our little study here will change all that, but my point is rather that I think the work we are doing is highly relevant for so many other areas of knowledge, and social science not least, where there is almost always a spatial dimension to things. So summing up, I hope that this has made some kind of sense. I started up with some discussion here about the idea about spatial capital as that kind of hidden dimension almost in the traditional production values, and not least when it comes to land. And also going back to the whole idea of how this can be described, as it has been done for a long time in space syntax, but also highlighting a few of the things where we may have done some contributions from the Swedish side. And then also moving into how, of course, that kind of description enhances the use value of all these different processes in cities, which often today formulate the large challenges we're facing. And that's something that's also been done in many universities around the world, not least using space syntax and so forth. But maybe we have a little bit of an original contribution when it comes to the ecological dimension there that I wanted to highlight. And then, of course, how this all can be brought into practice today, and not least when it comes to the planning practices, often are the public authorities or the actors doing that, and how this kind of knowledge that we will contribute to could be very useful in their practice, and also lead to one would hope better and more successful in that sense urban planning and design, and not least when it comes to relieving some of these huge urban problems that we see today. So thank you very much. I think I end there.